Good evening. Welcome. Wanted to thank everyone for coming on this beautiful evening in this amazing theater, and I really wanted to start off by thanking the School of Visual Arts for donating this space to us this evening. So a round of applause. And folks are going to be coming in, so feel free, if you're in the wings, feel free to come on and find a seat. David Rhodes is the president of the School of Visual Arts, and we've been helped by his house manager, Bob Giovanelli, and Vincent Burke, who's the technical director in the back. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate it. Of course, we'll be hearing in a moment from our presenter, Deborah Rogers, founder of the Energy Policy Forum, and I just wanted to thank her in advance for joining us. She flew in from Texas to be with us this evening, so we really are indebted to her. The co-sponsors of tonight's forum on Frackonomics, I wanted to list off quickly my colleagues in government who care deeply about this issue, as do I and you, and they are Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, Congressman Gerald Nadler, State Senator Jose Serrano, State Senator Liz Krueger, State Senator Daniel Squadron, State Senator Adriana Espaillat, State Assemblymember Deborah Glick, State Assemblymember Dick Gottfried, State Assemblymember Brian Kavanaugh, State Assemblymember Linda Rosenthal, City Council Member Rosie Mendez, and City Council Member Gail Brewer. And I know several of them have said they're going to be joining us later this evening. Really, I couldn't have put together tonight without my team, who did a wonderful job in organizing this evening, and I wanted to recognize Laura Morrison, Jared Chassow, Robert Atterbury, Enrique Lopez, Cecile Scott, David Kruger, Arthur Tarley, and Kaylin Schick, who have done an amazing job in organizing tonight. But really, the advocates are the reason why this issue has blossomed into a cause for so many of us in New York State, in Manhattan, and beyond. And those groups are represented here tonight: Catskill Mountain Keeper, Damascus Citizens for Sustainability, Environmental Advocates of New York, Food and Water Watch, New York State Sustainable Business Council, NYH2O, and Sane Energy Project. Round of applause for all the work they do. And my good friend Ling Zhao from United for Action for all of her help and guidance. I wanted to recognize Dr. Michael Ben Eli, founder of the Sustainability Laboratory, Nicole Dillingham, board president of the Cooperstown-based environmental nonprofit Otsego 2000, who came down for today's presentation, so thank you so much. And as you know, tonight we're going to hear about fracking. We've heard a lot about the environmental impacts, but not so much about the economic impacts. And that's the other side of the story, the one that needs to be told so that we have an answer to those in the industry and the public relations teams who say that hydrofracking is the silver bullet that will jumpstart our New York State economy. And turn around lives of residents in depressed towns, not just in America, but across New York State. But we're going to hear that the other side of the story is that fracking isn't an energy revolution, but a market bubble. And to be sure, the premise of the industry's economic argument, namely that upstate is crying out for the alleged economic boon of fracking, is false. There really is no upstate or downstate divide on the issue. Towns, counties, land trusts, citizens throughout the state have spoken out against fracking, and the polls show that. The state, thankfully, so far, is listening. After sustained pressure from everyone here, from our elected officials, from advocates across the country, Governor Cuomo's administration took a positive step. In this past February, in the fight against hydrofracking, pursuant to request made by the Commissioner of the State Department of Health, the State Department of Environmental Conservation announced that it would delay the finalization of its environmental impact statement on hydrofracking until the ongoing study of the potential health impacts is completed. But we need to do more. We need to stop fracking in its tracks. So we're gaining allies every day. A Siena Research Institute poll released just this Monday showed that just 37% of New Yorkers support fracking. But we can't let up because the industry, as I think Deborah will explain, is only doubling down. We have a lot of work to do. I want you to know that in the Senate and in the State Assembly, and we can talk about this later, but there are a number of bills that I and my colleagues who are sponsoring tonight's presentation support. One that would ban fracking throughout New York and that protect the public from exposure to radon and natural gas coming into our state, S673 and S4921, if you want to write that down. And in addition to that, we're fighting to pass legislation to pass the first ever limits on greenhouse gas emissions in New York State. And I was also proud to support, along with my colleagues in the Senate, a solar incentive program that will promote clean energy generation. So, on to Deborah. Deborah Rogers is the founder of the Energy Policy Forum, a consultancy and education forum dedicated to policy and financial issues relating to shale oil and gas and renewable energy. She began her financial career in investment banking in London. She later returned to the U.S. as a financial consultant for several major Wall Street firms before striking out on her own as an entrepreneur. She made award-winning artisanal cheeses, among other things. She lectures on shale gas economics throughout the U.S. and abroad, and is really the go-to authority on the topic for radio, television, print, and online media. She is a terrific resource for everyone who opposes fracking. Earlier this year, she was appointed to a three-year term on the U.S. Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, an advisory committee within the U.S. Department of the Interior. And this May, she testified by invitation before the U.S. Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. Now, she is wearing this very cool headset. I told her she looks like Madonna. So we're very lucky to have her here this evening, and I want everyone to give it up for Deborah Rogers.
Okay, my cool headset here. I get to make a dramatic entrance, as Senator Hoylman said, walk around here. So thank you so much for turning up tonight. It's such a lovely evening. I'm not sure I would have come to hear me. I really appreciate it. I am going to cover a tremendous amount of information in a very short period of time and then open it up, and I will stand up here and answer your questions as long as you have them. But hang on for the ride, because we're going to get started here, and we're going to move quickly. So, earlier this year in February, Energy Policy Forum issued a report called Shale and Wall Street, Was the Decline in Natural Gas Orchestrated? It is my contention that shales should have come unraveled. They're coming unraveled as we speak, believe it or not, but they should have come unraveled after the economic downturn, and they didn't. And the reason that they didn't is because a number of the large Wall Street investment banks, I call them the usual suspects, the Goldmans, the Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, etc., saw an opportunity to substitute essentially the fee generation that they had been getting off the mortgage-backed securities, derivatives, and other products. And they substituted shales for that. Shales then became the number one profit center at these banks after the economic meltdown. And we're going to talk about that and then go into some of the reasons, some of the fundamentals. So essentially it was interesting what the banks did, at least to my mind. They basically used the same playbook that they had used with the mortgage-backed securities, the lead up to the mortgage-backed securities crisis. And that was used a lot of off-balance sheet financing. And the problem with that is that it creates problems for analysts or investors to really see what a company is doing and what their financials really are. If you have off-balance sheet financing, you can't really tell. And you may recall that Thomson Reuters broke the story on Chesapeake Energy, and it turned out that they had 1.1, actually it went up after that, but the initial reports were $1.1 billion in off-balance sheet financing that even the analysts who covered the stock on a day-to-day basis, many of them were completely unaware of this debt within the company. So it's a little bit of a problem. Also, you may recall that the banks, they took people from the ratings agencies and basically reverse engineered product so that it would pass the rating agencies and it would make it look like the product was much safer than it really was. And you can see here, I pulled this quote because it sort of encompassed everything down in one quote. This is an executive with Barclays Capital, and he's basically bragging. They won an award for a VPP deal for Chesapeake Energy, which is a volumetric production payment. It's a form of debt, essentially. Chesapeake would argue otherwise, but it's a form of debt. And as you can see, this executive readily admits that, and the other thing that they did in the lead up was they put people into financial instruments that they weren't qualified to be in. So have a look at this quote. He said, we had to get the structure right, and we guided the ratings agencies and institutional investors who did not necessarily have deep familiarity with the energy business through the complexities of natural gas production. It's a little bit of a problem for me. You may recall that in the lead up to the mortgage-backed securities crisis, they were bundling mortgages and then flipping them off again and again. Well, they essentially did the same thing this time with leases. Basically, as best I can tell, one of the primary differences is that with the mortgage-backed securities, the toxic assets were actually on the books of the banks, and that caused a problem because the banks are literally the bedrock, the financial bedrock of the world economic system. This time, the banks wised up. They took the toxic assets and they moved and let the oil and gas companies keep those assets within their own books. But they were still encouraging and promoting the bundling of leases, and that's exactly what happened with shales. You may have heard different stories about lease prices in my neck of the woods. I live in Fort Worth, Texas, by the way, which is in the heart of the Barnett Shale. And in my neck of the woods, they literally drove up signing bonuses just to sign your land, give them the mineral rights to your land. They drove them up to $30,000 an acre at one point. This was right before the financial downturn. But here's Aubrey McClendon, CEO of Chesapeake Energy, saying he gave this quote, or he said this to some financial analysts in a call, and he said, "I can assure you that buying leases for X and selling them to 5 or 10 times X is a lot more profitable than trying to produce gas at $5 to $6. Well, they eventually drove gas down under $2. But shales was and still is in some parts of the world, and we're seeing it now more in other parts, but it's a land grab. But it was basically essentially the same playbook, just instead of bundling mortgages, they were now bundling leases. So a lot of the mainstream financial press, when I first started talking about this, they said, oh, well, that's a very nice conspiracy theory, Deborah. And, of course, the industry said the same thing. Well, I don't believe in conspiracy theories. I believe in math. And the math is actually very simple here. So don't think I'm going to throw some esoteric math at you. I'm not. This is actually quite simple. There's some primary metrics that analysts and investors use to assess the health of an oil and gas company. And one of those primary metrics is production growth. And when you listen, if you were to get on and listen to an analyst call transcript where the analysts all get on and they listen to the corporate management tell them, it's kind of their cheerleading rah-rah speech, the first thing those companies will tell these analysts is, you will be glad to know that we grew production X percentage year over year. Because that is such a primary metric. So you can take the existing production, which is a number that anybody can Google and you can come up with it, and then you can add on these production targets. And the investment banks, the analysts, they put these production targets on these companies, and these companies will jump through all sorts of hoops in order to meet these targets, because if they don't, then the banks will downgrade their stock, and that gives them all sorts of problems raising monies in future. You want to keep that growth in your stock. You want to keep those analysts keen on your stock and keep them promoting it out in the field through their army of stockbrokers, basically. So you take existing production and you add on the production targets because you know these companies are going to pretty much meet them. And that's going to give you some sort of significant number. Now, I identified this just casually back in 2010. I noticed where we were heading with the price of natural gas, because you take that number and then you take what is the current demand in the U.S., and you could see right off that demand wasn't anywhere near supply. So you were creating considerable surplus or a glut. When you have a glut, prices can go in one direction and one direction only, and that's down. And so it was obvious to me back at the beginning of 2010 that gas prices were going to tumble, and they were going to tumble fast. So it's not a conspiracy theory. It's actually simple math. So what did this tumbling of the price of gas do for the investment banks? Well, have a look. In 2008, when the price was around $8 an average per MCF, they did about $15 billion in M&A. But as that price started to plummet, the value of the deals went up. That equates to significant fees for the investment banks, very significant fees. And as I stated before, shales became the largest profit center at quite a number of these banks. Now, do I have a problem with investment banks making money off fees and doing deals? Of course not. I used to be a banker, and I don't. That's what you do, and that's what you're supposed to do, and it's a healthy part of our financial system. Here's what I have a problem with, though. Within months, literally within months, those same deals began to go sour. Now, there's no way, if you're doing proper due diligence, and I assure you that they were, there's no way that those bankers did not know that those underlying assets were problematic. So here's what's happened. We've had 2 rounds of massive, massive write-downs in shales just since 2009. This is the latest round of write-downs, and I need to add some more boxes, except I started to do that last night, and then I realized I was going to cover up Marius Kloppers, and he's such a good-looking guy. So, but essentially, you can see these are pretty significant. And it seems to be gaining even more momentum, shall we say, because both Royal Dutch Shell and ExxonMobil just came out in the last month or so and announced significant write-downs even for them, even for that size of a company. Shell took $2 billion in write-downs, and Exxon took about a 60% hit to earnings from shale assets. So these assets are even impacting companies the size of Royal Dutch Shell and ExxonMobil. BHP Billiton, this is the CEO of BHP Billiton, by the way, they went in. BHP Billiton is a large Australian multinational. They went in and they bought all of Chesapeake's Fayetteville assets, and 18 months later, they literally had to write off over 50% of the purchase price. His shareholders were not very happy, let's put it that way, and Mr. Kloppers here had to give up his bonus in 2012. So I'm sure he wasn't very happy either. But as you can see, this is a little bit of a problem. So Frackonomics. Let's go into the fundamentals of fracking and what these companies and just natural gas and shale gas, unconventional gas, to begin with. Does everybody understand the difference, first of all, between unconventional and conventional gas, or shall I define it very briefly? Define it. Okay. Conventional gas is the old-fashioned type of gas well. Now, this is going to be a very simplistic definition, but it'll do. Essentially, you would do your geology, and you would hopefully identify a large sea or pool of gas or oil beneath the surface, and you would essentially drop your drill bit in, somewhat like a straw. That's very simplistic, but somewhat like a straw, and suck the gas or oil out, right? With shales, it's different. The technology, I have to give them credit for the technology. The technology is truly astonishing. I mean, it's like something from Hollywood. They can now go down with a vertical wellbore, and then when they hit the formation, which is just the shale strata, they go sideways. They literally turn. And this technology, if they wanted to, theoretically, they could probably do corkscrews and go around buildings. I know they can go around buildings because they've had to do it in Texas a few times because people didn't lease for other reasons. So, but it's truly astonishing technology. And then they send little explosives. They're about that big, and they send them down into the wellbore, and they perforate the steel pipe and casing, and they fracture, they explode the rock underground, and that releases the gas. Now, over time, those shales, because you know what shales look like, they're just kind of flat, and they're like levels. As you pull that gas or oil out, those shales tend to collapse in on themselves. And that's when they go in and they do what they call refracking. You may hear industry talk about refracking. Now, they went in and they did refracking in a very big way in the Barnett in 2009. And you'll be very pleased to know that it didn't increase production in a meaningful way at all. It was just extraordinarily expensive. So industry likes to throw this out and talk about refracts and all this and how wonderful they are. They're not wonderful. They have not been able to make much money off of them. It sounds flashy, so they use it a lot. So let's go in and kind of look at shales and the fundamentals of shales. Oh, I didn't finish my definition, did I? Yes, I did. Unconventional is just basically horizontal drilling with the hydrofracture stimulation. Sorry. Okay, I do a lot of these, and sometimes I kind of just go. So the first question I'd like to ask is, why are shales so hyped? Because I've never seen an investment in my 25 years in the investment world so hyped as shales. And I always tell people, I learned a long time ago that when the investment community is hyping something or a company is hyping something to this degree, look out. Start paying real attention because there's a reason for the hype. So I think shales are hyped for a couple of reasons, which we're going to go into in more detail in a moment. But what if I were to tell you that there are investments out there that are investing in core infrastructure projects with high gross margins, and the revenues are fixed for 20 to 25 years, and they're giving double-digit rates of return in this interest rate environment? Now that would, as an investor, that gets my attention, and it gets most investors' attention. What if I told you that the green economy or clean economy grew at 8.3% during the economic downturn? That also gets your attention. Well, let me tell you, it also gets the attention of the oil and gas industry. They know they are on the downward slope of hydrocarbon production. We don't have to sit up here and debate, will it happen next week or will it happen 100 years from now? The point is, they have a finite resource and it will happen at some point. And things are beginning to happen. These are actual deals that are being done. Pru Capital, GE, Warren Buffett, they're kind of quietly but behind the scenes pumping billions and billions of dollars into these large, mostly wind and solar, commercial scale wind and solar, but very large projects. And they're locking in double-digit rates of return in this interest rate environment. The job story. Industry likes to tell us all about jobs, and if you really pay attention, all of their jobs figures come from economic models. Now, anybody who's taken Economics 101 knows that economic models are only as good as their inputs. You can skew a model, you can reverse engineer it, you can do all sorts of things by just changing the inputs, and you can make that model say anything you want it to say. So in their case, they start telling you about, we're going to create 600,000 jobs, and now I think it's up to like 2.3 million. Not really, they're getting a little bit drunken on their own PR, but anyway, we went in and did some work, as did others, and it was very interesting what we found. When you start parsing out these jobs, they do what they call indirect jobs, and they use a multiplier. So they say, we have this number of direct jobs, and then we're going to use a multiplier, and that's going to create indirect jobs, and that's where they get these huge figures, okay? But what we did was, and others, we went in and we parsed out the jobs that they were counting, and no kidding, the oil and gas industry in those glowing jobs reports are counting jobs like strippers and prostitutes in the mix. Now, admittedly, that's job creation, right? But it's not the sort of job creation that you or I think of when we hear, President Obama stand up in the State of the Union address and say we're going to create 600,000 jobs. I bet Obama doesn't know that it includes strippers and prostitutes. I don't know, who knows, maybe he does. So what I did, because I don't like to use economic models, sometimes they have a place. They can be good. Sometimes you have to use them because you don't have anything else. You're trying to extrapolate into the future and see. However, in this case, I don't think we need them. And this is the reason why. I went into the Bureau of Labor Statistics and I pulled the direct industry jobs. These are just the people employed directly in oil and gas. Now, this isn't just for shales or unconventionals. This is for all oil and gas, onshore and offshore. So the direct industry jobs are 181,000. Then I went in and I pulled from the BLS, and I just looked at wind, solar, and geothermal, just those three. There are other renewables, but I just took the big three. And they have approximately 183,000. So the jobs are about the same. But here's what, you can't just stop with numbers. You have to kind of flesh out the entire picture, because you have to look and see what percentage of electricity generation capacity does oil and gas provide. It turns out they provide 45% of our electricity generation, whereas renewables are only providing about 15%. And actually that number's a little bit high. It's really about 11, but if you stretch it, let's say 15, okay? As you can see, renewables, or that clean economy, are providing significantly more jobs per kilowatt. And that's really where that's where oil and gas really goes. If you take transportation fuels out, it's for electricity generation. They're creating significantly more jobs per kilowatt than oil and gas. I can assure you that is not lost on the oil and gas industry, and that is why every 5 minutes you turn on your television and you're hit with how many jobs the oil and gas industry is creating today. Now, if these companies, if this was truly an energy revolution, and this was game-changing, and this was going to go on for decades and decades to come. I love that phrase. They all use it, and now I use it all the time too. Shale is supposed to last decades and decades to come. If that were the case, then these companies ought to be healthy, shouldn't they? Because we keep hearing how they're producing gas and it's at record quantities, and it is, and we'll go into why that is in just a moment. But they should be healthy. They should be making money hand over fist, and they're not. One of the reasons that I use free cash flow, we're going to talk about free cash flow, and don't worry, you're going to understand this even if you don't have a business background. One of the reasons I use free cash flow instead of cash flow is that anybody who's an accountant in here or has taken accounting knows that you can do all sorts of very interesting things with cash flow. Free cash flow is a little bit harder to fudge. I'm not saying it can't be fudged, but it's much more difficult. You can't use as many creative combinations, let's say. So let's look at, I took a universe of 5 shale companies, and I took these companies because, for 2 reasons. They are almost exclusively just in shales. There's no offshore operations, so you don't have to muddy the waters like it would be very difficult to figure out with Shell or Exxon, because they have so many other types of operations other than just shales. These companies basically just do shales. In addition, they're onshore, and I picked them because they were in different shale plays, so that someone couldn't come back to me and say, well, that's true for the Barnett, but it's not true for the Bakken. Yeah, it is. So let's look at this. This is their capital expenditure. In red, this is how much money these just five shale companies have spent $56 billion in capital expenditure since 2010. This is how much money they've made in free cash flow. It's negative. In fact, it's worse than negative. As you can see, it's dropping each year. It's getting worse and worse. So they haven't even made $1 for $56 billion in capital expenditure. In fact, they're losing significant monies. This is Chesapeake here, and this is interesting because in here, Chesapeake has sold about $15 billion in assets, and it hadn't helped. They're not making any money. So there's a little bit of a problem there. So what are some other fundamentals that are going on here? Well, this is something that a lot of people don't know. Believe it or not, the majors have been struggling. The majors have not been able to, and by the majors, I'm talking about the big boys, the really big boys, the Shells, the BPs, the ConocoPhillips. They have not been able to grow production in a meaningful way, or grow reserve replacement in a meaningful way in over a decade. In fact, ExxonMobil in 2012 announced their reserve replacement ratio And let me very briefly go into what that is. Basically, if you're an oil and gas company, you remember we talked about the primary metrics? Well, this is another one. You want to be able to show that the production that you're selling off, because you have a finite resource, the production that you're selling off, you're replacing. And you want to show that you're replacing a little bit more, hopefully, than what was sold off and used up. So ExxonMobil, for 2012, down in the fine print, admitted that 40% of their reserve replacement was coming from 2 shale plays, one of which is the Woodford, which has 2 rigs operating at the moment. The Woodford's done. It's over, basically. And the other is the Bakken. And the Bakken, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Bakken here in a moment, but the Bakken, you hear a lot about the Bakken. Industry is very keen on, sorry, my nose tickles. Industry is very keen on the Bakken at the moment because it's shale oil. I'll go into that. In fact, I came out in 2010. Somebody asked me about shale oil when they first announced they were going to do it, and I said, here's what I think. I'm a girl, so I can say this. Shale oil is a shale gas makeover. It's the same girl, different shade of lipstick. And I was right. So the majors have been struggling. And they're not able, they're relying pretty heavily now, apparently, much more heavily than even I thought and some of my colleagues, because I didn't believe what I read, and I sent it off to some geologist friends, and I said, did I read this correctly? And they were like, oh my God, I had no idea that Exxon was counting that heavily on shales for reserve replacement. So you can see it's getting harder and harder to find hydrocarbons, and so now they're trying to convince us that what they found in shales are cheap and abundant and are going to last us decades and decades to come, when in fact they're not. Recovery efficiencies. What that means is when in the old-fashioned conventional type of wells, you could, like I said, you'd do your geology, you would identify your sea or pool of gas, and you could put the drill bit in, and you would recover typically 75 to 80% of what was down there, gas or oil in place. With shales, it's averaging 6.5%. So when Terry Engelder gets up and talks about the gazillion, quadrillion feet of natural gas in the Marcellus, ask him about that 6.5% of it that he's going to get out. Energy return on energy invested. This is another thing. Hydrocarbons are not cheap and easy to find anymore, in spite of what they're telling us about shales. This is a simple ratio that the industry uses and other scientific entities use to determine how much energy have we expended in order to get energy out. And so in the early days of crude, you would expend about 1 barrel of crude to get 100 barrels out. That's what that 100 to 1 means. Today, you expend about 1 barrel to get 11 barrels of crude out, and this includes offshore and so forth. Tar sands, 1 to get 3 barrels out. Shales, we're still doing the work on it, but it looks like it's going to come in at about 4 to 5 to 1. So these are not efficient fuels to pull out of the ground. We're having to expend an enormous amount of energy itself just to get this stuff out of the ground. And that's a problem at some point, if not now. Externalities. There are quite a few externalities. We're still working on some of these. But this one, I love these. They're kind of my favorite. Road damages. Industry loves to talk about severance tax revenue and that they pay billions and hundreds of millions of dollars in severance taxes. Severance taxes, or in Pennsylvania what they call impact fee, it's basically the same thing. It's the tax that a state levies on the extraction of the minerals. And industry does indeed pay a fair amount of money. But as you can see, and these figures are taken from the state comptrollers and the State Department of Transportation. As you can see, in Texas, and this is for all onshore and offshore oil and gas in Texas, we took in $3.6 billion, but our road damage just from shales in the Eagle Ford, the Barnett, and the Permian, and the Haynesville, are estimated to be $4 billion. Pennsylvania has taken in $204 million. Pennsylvania made a huge mistake by not implementing a severance tax at the beginning. That their leadership really made an enormous mistake. They now, just to maintain the roads, $3.5 billion. PennDOT estimates that to actually do the roads properly and replace what needs to be done, $7 billion. The same thing in the Bakken. I don't have that box up. I've made a new slide, but I didn't. It's not quite finished yet. Same thing in the Bakken. I believe they've taken in $3.5 billion in severance tax since 2010, and it's $7 billion estimated road damage. Arkansas, $182 million. This is cumulative since 2009 that the state of Arkansas has gotten, and they estimate their road damage at $450 million. Now, that means that the local communities, A, have to live with very bad roads, and B, that those costs are being passed off onto the taxpayers. So that's wrong. These companies are essentially privatizing profits and socializing costs. That's not right. They tore these roads up, they need to fix them. Here, well, there's North Dakota right there. Sorry. As I said, it's not quite finished. But anyway, another interesting aspect of this, lack of confidence. There's a lack of confidence, believe it or not, within the industry itself. You saw up here in the Marcellus, Norse Energy put their Marcellus leases up for sale at in December of 2011, and they were supposed to have some of the best leases in New York State. And by the end, December of 2012, a year later, nobody had picked them up. Nobody wanted them. So nobody within the industry was willing to step in and pick those leases up. Norse ended up declaring bankruptcy. Anschutz, as you I'm sure well know, they just let their leases go. But my favorite one is in the Bakken, because it involves a company that was proposing to build a crude pipeline. Now, pipelines are interesting entities because they're very expensive to buy, or I'm sorry, to build. But once you've built them and you recoup your initial costs, as long as you have a hydrocarbon there that will run for decades and decades to come, as they do in conventional fields, you have a cash cow on your hands. I mean, those things are money makers. They're just like money printers. And Wonock is the company, and they tried to put together a few investors to go in and build a pipeline out of the Bakken, and nobody would go in on it with them. Now, you have to wonder why, and it was interesting. I wrote a post about this, and it got picked up by a lot of industry publications and republished. And I don't think there's any doubt about what happened. Industry knows, in spite of all the public rhetoric and the hoo-ha and rah-rah stuff, they know that the Bakken wells are depleting so rapidly. By the way, we've looked at all the shale production on every shale well. The Post-Carbon Institute has done this. On all 65,000 shale wells, oil or gas in this country, and based on actual production, not projections or what industry is, but based on what the wells are actually doing, the Bakken wells are played out by year 6. They're done. They're finished. All shale plays in the U.S. will be at stripper well status, or in other words, they will need to be abandoned, plugged, by 2024. This is not a long-lived exercise. But this pipeline, so they couldn't get other companies within the industry to go in and put the monies up for this pipeline, because I think they knew it's not going to be long-lived enough. We're not going to be able to recoup our upfront costs in time. And so industry decided they would ship the crude by rail. Shipping crude by rail costs 3 times what it costs to ship crude by a pipeline. And the industry put a huge spin on it. It was a great public relations exercise, very funny to read. But anyway, that's what they're doing. And they decided not to do the pipeline because they could not raise the money within their own rank and file. Exportation. Exportation is being pursued to save ailing balance sheets, basically. It's very simple math. Once again, you have the domestic price at about $3.50 for the exact same amount of gas. For a long-term contract to China, you can get paid as much as $18. That's an enormous spread. You can extract it, pipe it, refine it, and ship it to Asia for all-inclusive cost of about $9 and get paid as much as $18. Now, if you're an oil and gas company, you're in the business, quite rightly, to extract hydrocarbons and get them to the client that will pay the most money. And in this case, that's Asia. And that's why shale exploitation is being pursued. It is not going to give us energy independence. It can't give us energy independence. We are the global energy markets. We spent the last 40 years trying to globalize and make these markets global. And now we're just going to pull out? No, that isn't going to happen. And we can't. But what we are going to do, and this is what I testified before the Senate committee about, that I find very, very problematic. Two things. We're locking ourselves into long-term contracts on a commodity that we know now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, because we can look at enough well production history, we know that these wells deplete at alarming rates. So we're locking the U.S. into, we're saying we are going to give China or Japan this gas for the next 20 years, and we got to come up with it come hell or high water. And it doesn't, and it's on a commodity that depletes very rapidly. That's the first thing. Second thing is that history tells us, and economic history is replete with examples of this, that if you will make more money taking any natural resource a country has, you will make more money by taking your own natural resource and turning it into a finished product and exporting that than exporting your natural resource. In fact, that ends up giving an odd economic outcome, actually, which is called the resource curse, and it ends up impoverishing areas rather than enriching areas where resource extraction takes place. Pennsylvania, I think rural Pennsylvania is a classic example of that, as is rural Texas. But that is why shale exploitation is being pursued. It is not being pursued, this whole business of wrapping ourselves in a red, white, and blue flag, and it is just nonsense. Even industry insiders are uncertain about shale and its future. This is a quote from Lee Raymond, who was the former CEO of ExxonMobil, and he says, "You have to test whether or not the resource base is sufficient. I'm not sure we have enough experience with shale gas to make the kind of judgment you have to make," and that's my point entirely. We are locking ourselves into long-term contracts on a commodity that depletes very rapidly, and it doesn't look like the resource base is going to be sufficient. And then John Hofmeister, to sustain growth, companies will need to drill many wells at a rate far beyond the capacity of the industry at present. And that's the truth. If you look at what you would have to, the number of wells that would have to be drilled, basically Post Carbon ran these numbers and found that in the Marcellus, and I hope I'm going to get these numbers right because I'm doing this off the top of my head, but in the Marcellus, you basically need to drill something like, I think it's like 600 wells a month just to keep production growing. Just to keep it flat, you need 7,000 wells. That can't be right. You need 7,000 wells for the U.S., at a cost of $42 billion per annum just to keep shale production flat. The industry can't drill that many at present. They don't have the capacity, and that's what Hofmeister is talking about. But that's what it's going to take. By the way, almost every shale play in the U.S. is already in decline. I don't know if you know that. The Marcellus peaked about 6 months ago, maybe 7 months ago, and it plateaued, and that's the sign that it's about to go down. And I bet if we go back and look at the numbers now, you'll start seeing that it's in decline. The Barnett, the Fayetteville, the Haynesville, the Bakken. The Bakken's interesting because it's their poster child. The Bakken per well production peaked in June of 2010, 3 years ago. Now they have more than doubled the number of wells in the Bakken since that time. And see, this is the treadmill that we talk about, because just to keep it looking like shale is this great game changer, they have to go engage in a frenzy of drilling. And eventually that catches up with them, because the older wells deplete so quickly that it doesn't matter how many new wells they bring online, they can't keep up with the decline in the older wells. So when you hear industry say, well, the Bakken production's been moving up, well, yes, it has, but it hasn't been moving up in per well production. And that's really what you need to look at. And the only reason it's moved up, if you just say the production has moved up, is because they've added considerably more. They've more than doubled the number of wells. But if you look at per well production, it's going in the opposite direction. This is a classic example. This is my hometown. This is a classic example of this. In 2008, the city of Fort Worth told us we were all going to be shale-yonaires. I'm not kidding. Shale-yonaires. Mailbox money, they called it. And they did indeed take in $50 million in gas drilling revenues off 44 wells. And it did appear that we were going to be shale-yonaires to most people. But by 2012, this number, and by the way, it had dropped pretty steadily the entire time. This number was down to 23 million. Only now we have 400 wells. So the number of wells increased tenfold and the revenues fell. I can give you example after example after example after example of this very thing. And you pick a play, any play, and I'll give you an example. That's the problem with shales. So if you're counting on long-term revenue generation from this, it isn't going to happen. In fact, in early 2013, back in January or February, a reporter called me because he had sat in on a city council meeting, like a closed, it was a small session. I don't know, it couldn't have been closed, but he sat in on it. And he said the city manager got up and told them, he said, the Barnett's done. Don't count on the monies from the Barnett anymore. Now, the Barnett was supposed to go on for 40 or 50 years, they told us. It only got started in earnest in 2006, and by 2013, it's done. So, shales are not long-lived. You were talking about, Senator Hoylman mentioned about greenhouse gas emissions. This, I'm going to conclude very quickly with these couple of slides because I think it's quite astonishing. Methane, as you may or may not know, is considerably more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. It doesn't last as long in the atmosphere, but it's more potent. And this, because they drove the price, with this frenzy of drilling, they drove the price of natural gas down. Natural gas isn't even worth their while anymore. And so in the Bakken and the Eagle Ford, which are their two, oil plays, they're just flaring a lot of this gas off. And this is what the flares look like in the middle of a cow pasture at night on a Google map. Those are nothing but natural gas being burned off into the atmosphere. Now, flaring is an antiquated process. They should never flare. They don't have to flare. Most first world countries don't allow it. It's banned in most first world countries. They don't need to do it. They do it because it's cheap. And they're doing it here because they just don't care. They just want to get the oil out and they don't care about the gas. Now that is our natural resource that's just going up in flames. But the other problem with flaring is that in the field, and this has been peer-reviewed and tested and so forth, in the field, flares run at about 65%, if you're lucky, efficiency. Industry will tell you, it burns off 99% of the gas in a lab, not in the field. Stroesher did an amazing study for the Canadian government, which has been adopted by most first world countries back in 1999, and he worked on this very thing, and he found that benzene was still at quantifiable levels from a natural gas flare as much as 5 kilometers, 3.5 miles downwind. And that's a known human carcinogen. So this is, I keep doing that, this is just flares. That's just wasting our natural gas. Industry is flaring enough gas to power all the homes in Chicago and Washington for a year. Here's the Eagle Ford. You can see that crescent shape, and those are the cities of Austin and San Antonio. Again, the Eagle Ford's out in the middle of nowhere. So we have become one of the worst offenders for gas flaring, and the amount that we're burning off has tripled in the last 5 years, according to the World Bank. So, from a climate perspective, that is highly problematic, not to mention all the fugitive emissions coming from the wells. So, that's it. Now you get to blast away with questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deborah. That was really, really interesting. I wanted to note the website for folks because Deborah and her research requires assistance from people like you and me. So I hope you'll consider going to energypolicyforum.org and making a contribution. And we have microphones on each side, and some runners who will direct you to assist you with your question, but I wanted to start off, Deborah.
Okay.
First, thank you again. Fascinating, and your graphics look great on this screen, by the way. On the issue of the critics, and you must have legions of them in the oil and gas industry. What can we say to rebut them? What is their typical response to your presentation, and what do you say back?
Interestingly enough, the industry doesn't like me. But they have, with one exception, which Energy in Depth did about, I don't know, a year or so ago, and it was very, very poorly done. They have never taken on my work. And I think the reason that they don't do it is because I pull all of this from their own 10Ks. And it's a little bit hard when you're using a company's numbers against them, or I pull it from their own production histories filed with the state. So if they want to take umbrage with that, then they're basically admitting to fraud. And so it's been interesting to me because the only, basically the bulk of the criticism from industry against me has been personal attacks. She's a goat farmer. She's an ex-model. Like, I'm supposed to be ashamed of that? Okay. Well, she's this, she's that. Funnily enough, I was sitting at dinner one night in Texas, and I had been on MSNBC the day before and talking about fracking, and apparently I upset Aubrey McClendon, so he asked to go on the next day. And he got on there and he started ranting and raving. Apparently, I didn't see it. I just got about 1 million emails and texts all of a sudden while I was eating. And it was very funny because apparently he got on there and he said, "Who are you going to believe, some goat farmer from Fort Worth or me?" And I thought, this is great. He just made me 1,000 times more famous than I ever should have been. I mean, it was just great. So it has been interesting. It's been all character assassination, but virtually no criticism of my work. The other thing I'm proud of is that they have been invited to be on panels with me, and they won't come anymore.
Wow.
I think that's...
And if I could just ask, yeah, if I could ask one more question. You know, when you showed the profits basically in the negative for the big petrochemical gas and oil companies, where are the shareholder lawsuits over this?
Well, there are some. Actually, there are. There are quite a number of class action suits, particularly against Chesapeake at the moment. There's some very interesting things happening. In fact, Trillium Asset Management, just yesterday somebody sent me their press release, and they have now dumped all the stock in Range Resources because they said that Range was contemptuous, essentially, of the shareholders, of which they were one large institutional shareholder. So it is happening, and there are things like that going on.
Great.
Yeah.
Some questions now? Yes. Sir.
Grab my water here.
Okay, by the way, just a quick note. New York has no severance fees, so if, for whatever reason, fracking does get started here, we're going to be like Pennsylvania. They're just going to destroy our roads and the rest of the environment and not even pay for it like they do in every, in other states. At least they charge them. But, talking about, I think the main attraction of this presentation for a lot of people here is because here in New York City, just about everybody is against fracking. The concern I've got is that while it's wonderful to, to be opposed to fracking and to fight for the fracking ban, we got to think about what we're going to do instead. We have alternative technologies like ground source heat pumps that, according to Columbia, could heat and cool 800,000 of the buildings in New York City alone. And in this state, that's about 50% of our gas is used for residential purposes. Mm-hmm. The thing I don't understand is that when we have viable technologies like ground source heat pumps that can replace gas for heating and cooling for 50% of its use, why in the world aren't we focused more on replacing gas than simply trying to ban particular ways of obtaining it?
Well, that's a very good point. And I have to say, you can't just drop hydrocarbons overnight. We can't do that. We're too dependent upon them. My biggest concern is, and your question is very valid and I think a very good one, a very good point. My biggest concern is that we need to transition to more renewable sources of energy, and we need to be doing it now, and we need to be planning ahead for the future. And if we can use what natural gas we've got at the moment to help us transition into that, then I think that that's a much more stable way to handle the economy. But we most decidedly need to move into a new energy economy. Now, I think that there's, I like to tell people, because I think for a lot of us, we feel like, well, we just can't put, solar's not going to work and wind's not going to work. You hear that all the time. That's not necessarily true. It's getting more efficient. There's a company in Austin, Texas that part of the problem with solar, for instance, is the conversion rate. And it's typically, I believe, 10 to 15%. And they've got it up now using nanotechnology in the lab. They've got it up to like 75%. They have not been able to do it in the field, but I figure it's just a matter of time, and they'll work that out. But why aren't we spending money on that research and development? Why are we talking about spending literally billions and billions and billions of dollars to put in infrastructure for what is essentially a dying energy, which is hydrocarbons? And you're exactly right. We ought to be utilizing what we've got to make this transition as smooth as possible. Now, this is just my personal opinion, and I'm sure some of you will disagree with me, but I want as stable a transition as we can possibly have. And it scares me to death to listen to industry, because they're advocating business as usual. Don't worry about it. Drive your SUVs. Run your air conditioners all the time. It's not a problem. Don't use your heat pumps. You're exactly right.
And Deborah, following up on that, in terms of green and clean energy, you indicate that actually more jobs are created.
That's right. And it's interesting. I mean, if you really want to talk about job creation, then let's talk about job creation. I mean, let's look at the actual numbers. Those are direct industry numbers. People being employed directly by those industries, and it creates significantly more jobs. So why aren't we putting people to work, making a smoother transition away from hydrocarbons? That's where we ought to be.
Right. On the other side, is there a question along the... Yes, ma'am, in the red.
Thank you. If you would please help me understand the flaring, because I'm not sure.
Flaring?
There's a microphone. Yep. Hold on. If we could just get the mic. Yep.
Okay. If you could just help me to understand the flaring, because I've misunderstood it, tried to understand it. Now, recently someone tried to convey to me the idea that the flaring got rid of the methane, but it was going to be stopped because it was very noxious and neighbors didn't like it. I mean, could you give more detail on just what flaring is?
Flaring is essentially the gas is coming up out of the wellbore and they set it on fire, and it makes a most impressive flame. It's about 20 to 30 feet tall. It is deafening loud, like a jet almost loud. I'll give you an example of that. I was 2/3 of a mile away outside my kitchen door of a natural gas flare, and using a sound meter, and the decibels were 80 at 2/3 of a mile away. It is deafening up near it. It's most impressive. I mean, it's this huge flame, and that's what I was talking about. It does not, industry will tell you that it burns off 98-99% of all the gas. It does not. They can create a flare in a laboratory and have those conditions. What Stroesher found in his extensive study of natural gas flares was that in the field you were lucky if you got 65% burn efficiency off a natural gas flare, which meant that yes, it was noxious. You are getting the benzene, you're getting the which is the human carcinogen 3.5 miles downwind. You get a lot of other stuff too. We were getting carbon disulfide, and that's now showing up in all the natural gas plays. In fact, that's what's causing that and formaldehyde are causing the ozone problems, but carbon disulfide is a known neurotoxin, and like at my farm, we had it at 300 times what was normal for ambient urban air.
So I'm a little confused. Why are they burning it off?
Because it's cheap. What they'll tell you is we need to clean out the wellbore. And what they ought to be doing is what is called a green completion, which means you need a pipeline in place, and then you complete the well, you hook the pipeline up, and the gas goes through, and you don't have to, you can clean out the wellbore other ways. But the gas never escapes into the atmosphere. This way, it's just a cheap and easy way for them to do it. And they don't have to have a pipeline in place. And like in Texas, they were very, very frank with us. They said, if we had told you what the pipeline, how much disruption was going to come from the pipelines, you would never have let us drill to begin with. So they go in and drill, and then you can't stop them from disrupting everything to put in a pipeline, because they say, well, we've spent all this money, now we have all these wells, you have to let us hook them up. But in the meantime, they flare the gas off.
And another use of Google Maps, which I never knew.
Yeah.
Another question on this side. Anyone on this side for a question? Yes, yes, sir.
I have a couple. It's just terrific. On the way that the land is assessed as being the plays, the potential productivity, I understand it's rather complicated. I've read about it, and I'm not quite. And is the SEC pursuing any of these? Because yes. I have Googled and I haven't found what's happening lately. And also one other thing, the TPP and how it's going to affect this.
Okay, I am not the best person to talk about the TPP. I've done absolutely no work on that yet. So I'm so sorry. I wish I knew or could talk intelligently about it.
What is TPP further?
It's the
Trans-Pacific Pipeline.
Oh, okay, got it.
No,
Trans-Pacific,
partnership.
Sorry, I got Keystone.
And there's, right now, one of the most critical aspects of the whole situation is that the fast track is simmering down beneath all the garbage that's going on in Washington. And if they fast track this thing, we won't have a chance. It'll undo, for example, if a town puts a ban on fracking in New York State, and an international corporation that's part of this TPP wants that gas, they have some leases, lots of luck, because we no longer have sovereignty.
That's a very good point. Deborah, you're on a federal commission. What has been your interaction with the Interior Department, the Obama administration?
Well, now, okay, and then I do want to go back, because the first part of his question was very good too, so don't let me forget it. But what I serve on is the U.S. Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which is a global initiative, and it's actually to reconcile revenues from oil and gas and hard rock mining on federal land. So it's a little bit different than just fracking. It's more looking at the numbers and making sure, because believe it or not, the government accounting office has good reason to believe that the operators don't pay the federal government what they ought to be paying. Imagine that. And this is a global problem. So this is an initiative that was started, and that's actually what I serve on. So I'm not sure that those two tie in together. I forgot, what were you?
Well, the first part of the gentleman's question.
The TPP and how it would...
No, the first part of your question.
Oh, the first part, yeah, the SEC and the...
Yes.
Right.
Yes, on the plays, there's so much information. I could sit here and give you 3 or 4 different presentations here tonight, and that is in another one of my presentations, is the SEC stuff, which I've done in some parts of New York, but not here tonight. Okay, let me start at the beginning. The industry went in, when I was talking about the land grab, what they did was they went in, and let's say this stage is a natural gas field, okay? And they said, you know what, shale is so simple, it's a manufacturing model. That's actually what they called it. They said, we can drop the drill bit in anywhere in here, and we're going to get the same amount of gas. It's homogeneous. Turned out that wasn't the case at all. It's not homogeneous. Shale plays contract down to core areas just like conventional plays. In other words, you still get that somewhat, it's a little bit different animal, but it's still like that sea or pool of gas in some areas. They know that now. They go in and they drill those areas out first. Makes it look like a brand new play is just stupendously good. And then they have to move out into more marginal acreage. But what they did in the beginning was they would go in, they'd say, this whole thing is homogeneous. We're going to get millions and billions of cubic feet of gas out of here. And so they would drill up a handful of wells and they would pronounce it, wonderful, and then they would flip those plays to kind of the next sucker. That's what happened to BHP Billiton. In fact, could I get my iPad, because I can read you a couple of quotes that kind of tie into this, which are brand new. Thank you very much. So, to give you an example of how much money these operators were able to make by in this game, they would go in and pay farmers typically in rural areas, maybe if they were lucky, $500 an acre, and they were flipping the same acreage at times for as much as $25,000. And so they were making a lot of money. And they proclaimed the whole field was proved up because they drilled a handful of wells, and it wasn't. So that was a bit of a problem. And that's part of these massive write-downs that you're seeing. That's part of it. Part of it is the decline in natural gas price. There are a number of factors going into this. But I'm going off on all these tangents. There's so many things. The SEC. The SEC went in, and I pulled, in one of my presentations, I give examples of letters that the SEC has written to companies, and it's quite fun, actually, because they sound very pompous and very formal, but they basically say, gee, we're really sorry, but the numbers you've given us are mathematically impossible. And please amend your filing, and what they found was the SEC is always going to be quiet. They're never going to come out and make a big production of kind of slapping these companies on the wrist, because it's bad for business and it's bad for the stock market. So they do it quietly. But what I do know is that they no longer, the companies when they're giving their dog and pony shows for IPOs, the way I found this out is quite funny, actually. A very good friend of mine, his son was out doing, and that's initial public offering, by the way, IPO. Sorry, I tend to just talk sometimes. And they were trying to raise monies, right? And on Friday afternoon, about 4 o'clock, the SEC called them and said, you have to amend all of your material by Monday morning, or we won't allow you to make any further requests for funds, meet with any further investors, until you amend and say that these wells will no longer last 40 to 50 years, they'll last 20 at the most. So they were upset with me. They said it was all my fault that they had to stay up all weekend revising their numbers, which I thought was very funny. So the SEC has done that, apparently. They're also looking at, there's a formal investigation now of Chesapeake Energy, and the Department of Justice is also investigating Chesapeake, but they've upped it to a formal, the SEC has upped it to a formal investigation, and they're looking at well lives and how they come up with these figures, and the figures for the reserves. What we know now is these companies they overestimated reserve, the total amount of gas coming from the wells. When they went out and raised the monies or told and made presentations to investors, they would tell them that the wells were averaging a certain, what they call EUR, which means estimated ultimate recovery. And we now know that the operators across the board have overestimated plays by a minimum of 100%, and some plays by as much as 400 to 500%. We know that from production history. And the problem with that is that the SEC changed the rules in 2009, and sorry, I hope I'm not boring everybody, but they changed the rules in 2009 for oil and gas. They allowed them to expand the definition of reserves, which in and of itself, there were good reasons for doing that, but it got taken advantage of, obviously. And suddenly companies, literally overnight when the rule went into place, companies like Petrohawk and Chesapeake, some of the more aggressive ones, their reserves jumped up as much as 200%, which made it look like their finding development costs had plummeted. That gets kind of technical.
So it's another kind of Halliburton rule.
Yeah. And but the funny thing is that when they changed these rules, the SEC and I went in and read every one of these letters. There was like 75 letters from industry to the SEC when they were getting ready to change the rule, and they put a lot of pressure on SEC they said, you got to love this. They said, it's not cost effective for us to have independent auditing of reserves. It would just be prohibitively expensive for us. Now this is coming from companies like ExxonMobil that spend $5 billion a quarter just buying back their own shares. You know, so.
Deborah, I wanted to introduce you to our next borough president and the great council member, Gail Brewer, who is here. Gail last week hosted a screening of Gasland 2 and had a very interesting panel discussion afterward, and she's been very outspoken on opposing fracking in New York. Gail, would you like to say a few words? I'd love for you to.
I just want to thank you, Senator Hoylman. I will tell you, for the audience to know, that we had a great Gasland 2, and we had 2 speakers afterwards. Obviously, we had Angela Fox, but we also had this gentleman named Brad Hoylman and another person named Dick Godfrey. And the audience kept saying, "Who's that nice young man?" You know, it wasn't me and it wasn't Dick Godfrey. I just want to say thank you for being such a great addition to the elected officials on the West Side. And obviously, this is an incredibly important topic, and we can't go to enough forums to learn enough. There's just no unfortunate end. And I think you're like the Julia Roberts of, Thank you very much.
You know, thank you, Gail. That's very well put. On the issue of learning enough, could we create an economic model that would show what the external costs would be on New York State's roads based on projected revenue from hydrofracking in New York?
We could do that if we had the funding, yeah.
Right, right. But we assume it's going to be a negative, just like it is in every other state.
Well, especially if you don't have severance tax revenue. I mean, there's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
So, but it's not just road damages. You got to look at healthcare costs. You've got to look at, there are quite a number of things. Agricultural damage. You know, even if you create jobs, you're going to lose jobs and other things. The Finger Lakes region, you've got a lot of tourism. That's going to be impacted. So, yeah, you would have to run quite a few models on the dead animals.
Right. Okay. Should we have another question on this side? Do we have a microphone on this side? Okay. Yes, sir, in the front. The white shirt.
First, thank you very much for your presentation. I was curious, you started your presentation by talking about the major investment banking firms, and you said that shale plays are now the major source of their profits. Could you tell me, or us, the audience, approximately what % of their profits they're getting from shale plays, and what your source of information is on that?
Well, that's the banks themselves. It became their #1 profit center. Shales did. When I talk about that, I'm talking about fees. So if you break it down, when they're doing deals, what is giving them the most fees? And so you can look at oil and gas, or you could look at, I mean, just pick an industry that they're doing deals on. But it turned out that shales were providing them the most in fees. And so that's what I meant when I said #1 in their profit center. Became their largest profit center within the bank in investment banking fees. And that was the slide I showed you on the amount of deals, the dollars of deals.
100% from just shale plays?
Just shale plays, yeah, just shales. Sorry. Should be right there. So, 15 billion in 2008 jumped up to 50 billion. 2009, 38 billion, 47 billion. Interestingly enough, the monies are drying up. I actually thought that would happen, and I actually went out on a limb and said it publicly in presentations beginning last February. The M&A fees have dropped 52% year over year for shales, for oil and gas, and the private equity has dropped 90% year over year as of the end of the second quarter 2013. And interestingly enough, the foreign money that was pouring into shales, there wasn't a single foreign deal announced in the second quarter of 2013. So that means that it's becoming harder and harder for these companies to raise monies, and that's a good thing.
Could you just clarify again, the blue bars are fees just from natural
Just
gas?
fees, just
not
from-
their M&A total fees?
No, just from natural gas.
Do you have any idea what percentage that represents?
I don't, not off the top of my head. No.
So,
It's just from
Deborah,
natural
are we getting close to the tipping point where industry is just going to say it's not worth it?
No, industry will say it's always worth it, but what will happen is if the banks aren't making large fees off of the deals, then it becomes harder and harder for the companies to raise monies, to get
Right.
more monies. And this is a very, very capital-intensive exercise. You saw.
Right, I'm sorry, I meant to say where the banks say it's not worth it, not the industry, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And
yeah.
that is that on the horizon?
It's already happening. That's what I was talking about.
Okay.
Private equity, 90% of the monies, if you looked at the amounts of deals done by private equity firms, it's dropped 90%. If you look at M&A deals overall for year over year from second quarter 2012 to second quarter 2013, it dropped 52%. Oil and gas is typically in the top 2 money makers. It has been since 2006. It went up to number 1 as of 2009, and it's now not even in the top 5 of the profit centers for the banks.
Wow.
Oil and gas deals.
Question on the
So-
other side. Caitlin, can we get the gentleman, oh no, the
I can't
individual
see.
on the aisle there, yes.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you. And you must be aware of the studies that are coming out of Stanford and Cornell. Mark Jacobson has
Mhm.
done this 600-page,
Mhm.
very detailed plan to change New York City's energy by 2030 to renewables by
Mhm.
like 80%. And there's a lot of, economic figures, and it's very detailed. What do you think of that?
I think it's very
that's helpful?
interesting. Yeah, I think it's very interesting. And another thing that they were explaining to me was that during the hurricane, if the East Coast had had all those wind farms offshore, that it would have dropped the wind speeds hitting land down to about 50 miles an hour, and there would have been significantly less damage.
And they
I thought that was fascinating.
Right, and they said that there would be significant outlay of money, investment to do this, but it's all in place. These are all technologies that are absolutely working right now.
That's right.
I didn't even mention the advances that are going to come.
And
that there would be a 17-year payback after 17 years,
Mhm.
which is paid for that.
Mhm.
So it's an amazing plan. I just can't believe it's not getting more publicity. And why isn't that being presented to our legislatures and being published on the front page of the Times? I don't understand.
Right, right. No, it's a very interesting plan. Very interesting indeed.
Thank you.
Yes.
This side, Arthur, the woman here, right in front of you. Come on up.
There's been a lot of compressor stations that are being built, a lot of pipelines very quickly, sometimes here without our knowledge,
They're already putting them in here in New York?
The Specters, I think I've read, is going to be operating later this fall. Although I'd be correct if the pipelines in through Jamaica Bay. The Millennium has been and they're building the compressor stations like crazy. So can you comment on this huge rush of putting in the infrastructure to feed the gas that's coming from
Well, I
the
find that
Marcellus?
if it is for shale production, I find that very concerning, because what that tells me is that somebody's already given them the go-ahead that it will be allowed at some point. They probably told them, you remember what I talked about, green completions? You have to have all that stuff in place in order to do green completion.
That's not what she's talking about. There's going to be no shale, there's going to be no fracking in New York City. What she's talking about is the fact that we have some new pipelines coming into the city.
To deliver the gas.
Okay, and also.
Oh, I'm sorry, okay. I
And
misunderstood.
And
You
also the
said
compression stations she's
And
talking
the
about
compressor which
is
pushes it.
the problem is that many more buildings in the city are converting to gas from number 6 oil, or it's filthy. And you need to, because the existing infrastructure is low pressure, they have to have compression stations to produce high pressure
Right.
gas for the buildings. But it has nothing to, there will be, I guarantee you, there will be no fracking in New York City. That just ain't going to happen. Okay, but there is a lot of use of natural gas in the city.
Fracking in New York
Right.
State using that infrastructure.
Yeah.
That's the
Okay,
question.
yeah.
I don't know
How
enough
come
about
this
that.
huge
Yeah.
investment in infrastructure, which is going on, starting from inside Pennsylvania, going to New Jersey.
Right.
There's a rush to build the infrastructure to deliver the natural gas to the metropolitan areas of the entire Northeast as far as
That's correct.
Boston.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I
but it
really
is,
can't answer.
and a lot of folks here have been fighting one of the pipelines, which is not far from here, off the Hudson, called the Spectra pipeline.
I was just wondering, what is the financial reason for doing this from an expert?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I can answer that question because it would depend. If you're stating that you think the gas is coming from fracked areas
Yes.
into the city,
Yes.
well, of course, it makes more sense if they are taking gas out in Pennsylvania, so it's got to go somewhere, and it does make more sense that it gets used in this immediate area than someplace else because the transportation costs are going to be so much less, and so their margins will be higher.
Great.
Beyond that, I'm not sure I can, because obviously I don't know enough about the specifics of this to be able to answer intelligently.
Right.
So I'm sorry, but
Kaylin, can we get the woman on the front row here? She's had her hand up.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. In case people aren't aware, the gas that we're using now in New York City as Con Ed customers, it's from an open source. We're already receiving Marcellus Shale gas. It's just a small amount. But because the source, the pipelines, or however it's delivered to us, is called open source, it comes from different sources. And the Pennsylvania Marcellus Shale gas has been added to that. So we're already getting some of this in our homes. And I guess as an expert, as an economics expert, I mean, if they've spent all this money, we have not fracked. The experts, some people have said that we've been successful so far in delaying fracking in New York State. But the construction of pipelines, the infrastructure, as someone else just mentioned, has been going ahead. It's a huge financial investment. From your background, what is the likelihood, if you're already building it, doesn't it mean that they're planning to frack?
well, that's what I'm saying. I'm not sure I can answer that question. I wouldn't. I mean, I'd have to look at a larger picture, but I wouldn't necessarily jump to that conclusion because if what they're planning to do is pull the gas out of Pennsylvania and Ohio or whatever and bring it into New York State, that doesn't necessarily mean that they would have. It doesn't necessarily mean, and I'm working blindly here because I obviously I have not kept up with your local pipeline issues, but it doesn't. I wouldn't jump to that conclusion.
Okay. Just one more thing on the front page of today's Wall Street Journal. There was an article now the U.S.
Don't read the Wall Street Journal.
They're approaching being a number one oil and gas producer.
I'm sorry. Who was the number one?
The U.S.
Oh,
That they're approaching that point. Well, this sort of concerns some of us because of LNG ports being planned off for export and the prices you mentioned for gas in China. So I wonder if you had any comments on that.
I most decidedly do. Where they're getting those numbers, and I didn't see the article, but I'm certain that they're getting them from EIA. And EIA is the Energy Information Administration, part of DOE, and they're the forecasting arm. Now, EIA, and I just participated in a working group at EIA, so I guess you can kind of blame me, sort of. But EIA had recently come out with these numbers. I mean, you can't really blame me. I don't mean it that way. I'm not that high up in EIA, but EIA came out with these numbers and stated that the U.S. was going to be, the largest oil and gas producer in the world by, I think it's 2030. We're supposed to be, and we're well on our way now. And they gave all this forecasting. Okay, EIA does. Not very many people know this, but they do a retrospective analysis of their own forecasting every year. It's very interesting because when you go in and try and pull up, like, for 2011, it disappears immediately when they put the retrospective forecast for 2012, and the reason is because they're so bad at forecasting you can't even believe. So they've gotten the price of natural gas wrong consistently, because I've learned now you go ahead and print it all off so you have hard copies because it disappears off the website. But they're consistently wrong about the price of nat gas 76% of the time, I think. They're consistently wrong about the price of crude like 72% of the time. They're consistently wrong about the effect of crude prices on GDP 94% of the time, I think it is. I mean, they are so bad. It's not all their fault. They have to get their data from somewhere, and they get it from industry. And having just participated in this working group, I mean, I literally was on a call last week, the second of the last, there were 2 calls. And it was very interesting to me because they're doing these models, and they put no elasticity in the models. Now, that's getting kind of, but it's basically like, well, this could just go on a trajectory upward forever because they don't factor in anything like demand destruction. Like we know, for instance, in the United States, when the price of oil went up to about $125, $130 a barrel, we significantly cut consumption. So we now know that the US and Western Europe, that's it for us. That's the top where we can go, and then it really starts to impact our economy. And China can go up to about 140, and then China's priced out of the market. Those are very interesting statistics. If you look at EIA's numbers, they don't factor in any of that. So they just say, oh yeah, when the price of crude is 225, it's going well, it ain't never going to get there because nobody's going to be there to buy it. So I'm sure that's where those numbers came from. And you just have to take them with, that was a long-winded explanation to say that they suck at forecasting.
And don't read the Wall Street Journal.
And don't read Wall Street Journal.
Question on this side? Yes, there's a gentleman raising a notebook.
So this might be a little bit off topic. I'm going to ask you as a Texan and as a sod buster.
Uh-oh.
Are you and your neighbors seeing any problem with communication? Because I heard the U.S. Geological Survey was looking at communication is the pollution of aquifers, the transmission of pollution. This is from deep well, putting bad stuff in the ground in wells to get rid of it. And they were seeing you have karst soils there. I hear, I guess it's throughout most of Texas. The porous, used to be a seabed anyway. Texas and Florida. I wonder if that's an issue for you and your neighbors of your wells, private wells, or municipal aquifers being impacted.
Yeah, there's so many wells near a metropolitan area.
From fracking fluid.
Yeah,
and so
we have 18,000 wells now, and there's there's 2,000 something in the city of Fort Worth, within the city. Some of them are like 200 feet from elementary schools. It's unbelievable. I'm not going to be the best person to answer that question either. That's not my area of expertise. I do numbers, but all I can tell you is anecdotal evidence. There is a man who lives not too far from me in Parker County. He was in Gasland too. Steve Lipsky is his name. And I happen to know his next door neighbors, and one of my great girlfriends lives just down the street. And there are now more of them than just Steve Lipsky in that neighborhood that can light their well water on fire. And the interesting thing about this is that this is a very, very affluent neighborhood. So in the past, the industry, at least in Texas, when we've had problems with water, questions about it, it's always been in poor neighborhoods and it all just kind of disappears, I'm sorry to say. Well, I don't think this is going to disappear because these people are mad and they're rich. And that's a little bit of a problem. Yeah. So I wish I could answer it better, but I will say this. EPA went out and did some work. I think I did hear that USGS was out there doing some work, and I know several universities have been out there doing some work as well. And there is migration in that particular instance because you've got several wells, and then you've got some other wells off over here, and they're all showing the same thermogenic fingerprint.
Kaylin, if you could, there's a woman near the top raising her hand.
Oh,
if you
thank
could.
I'd just like to say one thing about the pipeline. The frack gas has a much higher level of radon than regular gas. Radon is the second highest cause of lung cancer. And I have to tell you that the New York State Breast Cancer Network that just presented a breast cancer and hydrofracking, we are terrified of all the chemicals because many of the chemicals are linked to breast cancer. Additionally, in Texas, and I'd like to know if you have any more statistics on this, what we've seen is the counties in Texas that have hydrofracking have their levels of breast cancer on the rise, where the counties outside of that have it declining. So I don't know if you have any further information about that, but I want to say one more thing about radon and why this is terribly important to everybody who lives in New York City. Aside from the fact that this is one of the highest density places in the world, to have a pipeline coming in here is insane, but everybody who has a pilot light on their stove will be exposed to radon, to say nothing of the restaurants and the workers in the restaurants. This is a tremendously important issue, and it's because of the radon in the frack gas. And that scares the heck out of me. And I'll tell you, I've been a lifelong New Yorker. If that comes in, I'm out of here. I've had breast cancer. I don't want another cancer. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Deborah, it raises an interesting point. Do economists factor in these type of health issues in their externalities?
Yeah, we are starting to do some work on that, actually. But that becomes very difficult to do because you have to get, it's difficult.
Yeah.
But we want to be able to do that
eventually
and look at potential healthcare costs, look at potential agricultural damage costs. There are quite a number of things like that.
Yeah.
And
Arthur, there's a gentleman here who's had his hand up. Thank you. And we can take a few more questions. Thank you for your understanding.
Doing this. I saw Jurassic Park in this theater, and so that's kind of interesting because the oil
parallel,
dinosaurs,
right?
etc. Two of the things you said. One, I'm sort of supposing because the Bush family and other families are buying aquifer in other countries, South America, etc. So the question has to do with big oil buying into green energy and then treating it the same way as they are treating this form of energy production. Do you foresee them mishandling that in the same manner they're mishandling this? And then the other question is about when you say we are responsible for the next 20 years of contracts that are being promised, are you saying that the oil companies are, or is America, North America somehow responsible for those contracts?
Well, it's the companies, but you don't want to default on an export contract. And it has to do with the balance of trade. So it's not a good thing to lock yourself in. And that's why they have to get permission from the Department of Energy to export, because it brings in essentially the United States. So now on what was the first part of your question?
Aquifers.
The aquifers.
The mistreating of green energy by the oil companies because they have to be involved with this now because they know it's going to run out in the future. I mean, they know fossil fuels are going to run out in the future, so if they're thinking at all, they have to be involved with green energy somehow.
Right. Again, that's kind of speculation. You really don't know how they're going to treat it or what they're going to do. They certainly, so I don't know that I can really answer that question. I can say this.
Can you speculate?
I can speculate. I can speculate that they would be terrible at it. But I think I say this periodically, and I really do believe this. And I say it to people in the industry. I think we've done that industry a great disservice by exempting them from every major environmental statute because they haven't had to keep up with, they're not modern. You go out to a drill site and horizontal drilling is pretty impressive and it's pretty cool. But basically, that's all that's changed in the last 50 years. I mean, they look exactly like they did with a little bit, a few more bells and whistles. and they have not had to modernize like other companies have. And this is interesting. I was just talking to I actually date him, believe it or not. I date somebody who owns 4 petrochemical plants. That's not cool. But actually, he's come up with, well, anyway, I probably shouldn't say that, but anyway, no, he's very innovative. So I think he's going to kind of change
the enemy, right?
Yeah, that's right. But I think he's going to change the industry, actually. But what he was saying was, he said, when they first came, every time they come to me and they tell me, you got to modernize this, he said, I rant and rave and gnash my teeth and say, well, I can't make money doing this. And then he said, then the engineer in me sits down and I go, yeah, I can. What if I did this? And he said, and then I innovate and I get better and better and better. And he said, that's exactly what they ought to be forced to do. And he's actually angry that he has to meet standards that they don't have to meet. So, I don't know if that really answered your question.
I think there's, toward the top again, there's a gentleman in the middle has his hand up for a while.
And she has too. I keep seeing a white thing go up. I've seen it go up about 400
The gentleman
times.
in the middle, do you see he's right in the center? He's waving an iPhone. Yes.
I have a question about the liquefied natural gas here in New York State. They want to build export facilities. And are they using subsidies? What about the finances of LNG? Is it realistic to do LNG on any scale? Because I've heard that it costs more to create LNG, about $4 to $5 per million BTUs, to put it into the pipeline. And is it realistic to even sell that here in the United States? Or are they going to use it to export? And I also understand that one of the federal agencies is set to allow them to export and giving permits. They've sent about 23 permits to allow the export of LNG.
They've already given 3 permits.
Oh.
I think it is, yeah. The first one was to Cheniere, and the last 2, I can't remember who they're what. But if you look at Cheniere, basically what the industry did was they went and they took existing, we had 8, I think it was, existing import terminals. And they went to DOE and FERC, and they said, we want to flip those and make them export terminals now. And they got that first permit, let's see, Cheniere got it, I think it was almost 2 years ago, in October of 2011. And there was another one recently granted, like in the last 2 months, and then there was one granted back in the spring. So what they're doing, but okay, if I could talk about this, because I thought this was sort of interesting. So I went in and I looked, because I wanted to see how they were structuring those contracts, and you kind of touched on that a little bit. I wanted to see how they were going to make their money, and what I found was pretty interesting. This is in Cheniere's case, but I'm assuming it's across the board. These LNG facilities are very, very expensive. They're massively expensive. And so what they did was they lock in the price of gas, and then you can take a floating scale, or you can have a fixed rate. And the fixed rate would allow you to capture more money going further out. But what was interesting to me is that they chose to lock in a fixed rate, which said to me that they were giving up all the upside potential out here in order to amortize their costs as quickly as possible right here, which said to me, they know these wells aren't long-lived and that these contracts are going to be difficult to fulfill. They want to lock in and they want their return on investment as quickly as possible, and they're willing to give up all the upside.
Wow.
I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah. One more question, and I think the woman who had her hand there.
Yeah.
Arthur, can you give her the mic?
Here it comes.
Oh, it's coming from 2 directions.
I need my shades, then I really will look like Madonna.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. I just want to say, and I know you're not familiar with the local things, but I saw this in July or August in either the AM magazine, newspaper, or the Metro, a small paragraph that stated that fracking pipelines were being set up along the east side of Manhattan. No one seems to know anything about it. Nothing more was written about it, but I know I cut that little paragraph out. It was either July or August. That's all I want to say, that anybody here can Google it on AM. It's either AM newspaper or Metro. Did anybody read that?
It's not true. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Deborah.
Thank you.
And I acknowledge our signer for this evening, Gloria Vargas. So thank you very much, Gloria. And the next step of this conversation is for everyone who's not already to get engaged on this issue. So I would encourage you to go to energypolicyforum.com, join one of the, .org, join one of the organizations outside, get on their mailing list, stay in touch with my office or Councilmember Brewer when she becomes borough president. We're going to keep you informed, and we need to keep fighting. So thank you so much for coming tonight.